I am delighted to have the opportunity to open this symposium, as Artaud's writings have been a source of inspiration for my work over the years. Indeed, the keywords for the title, affect, effect, bodies, resonate at a deeper level with my more general academic interests and have been a bit of a constant in my research. As someone who is not strictly an Artaudian scholar, my areas of expertise are mainly Gothic literature and film, I feel I should start by giving some background on what directed my attention towards Artaud and his dramatic theories. This will hopefully, at the same time, serve as a form of introduction to the various points I will be making throughout this talk. When I started, some years ago now, looking for a connecting thread that would allow me to situate horror film within an affective continuum, I knew I wanted to escape the obvious choice, and that was for me the Gothic literary tradition. Let me explain. Although I believe that horror film owes a huge debt at a tropic and imaginary levels to the novels of Radcliffe, Lewis, the Shelleys, and later Stoker or Stevenson, I was unsatisfied with psychoanalytic approaches that read horror as a mostly symbolic and abstracted body of work. I therefore started a search that would eventually culminate in my doctoral thesis, which proposed an affective corporeal model for horror that understands the genre as always already engaged in affective processes with and through bodies. Anna Powell's work on Deleuze and film was foundational here, and it is not a coincidence that we have both ended up writing about Artaud, I think. In the early stages of this project, an esteemed friend suggested that I peruse Artaud's anti-representational theories on drama. I went and bought a copy of The Theatre and its Double, and I was totally taken by it. I saw in Artaud a man with a consistent project that was, like mine, incredibly enthusiastic about the effective possibilities of art, theatre, and most importantly, film. As a result, I would anchor the moment of affect in horror very specifically, and in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and of certain dramatic movements like the theatre of Cruelty. In what follows, I attempted to weave together some of Artaud's fragmentary writings and dramatic scenarios into a coherent narrative that will lead me to what I see as a dialogue between Artaud's oeuvre, surrealist cinema, and the horror film. So this is the first of two parts, and it's titled Drama, Affect, Cruelty. Artaud, whose championing of physical and visual forms of acting have been central to the development of 20th century performance, wrote very specifically about dramatic affect. His ideas about the theatre of cruelty have proved just as influential in later developments of corporeal transgression as the more visceral Grand Guignol. If the latter was concerned with exploring the limits of dramatic horror as an effective event, Artaud's theatre wished to shock the body into a new metaphysical state. Artaud's dramatic experiment, which failed after the disappointment of the Cenci, has been the subject of numerous publications in praise of its attempt to modernize theatre, and has often been connected to movements like the theatre of the absurd and surrealism. Artaud tried to captivate the masses, to revolutionize the relationship between stage and audience, and his work relied heavily on visual sensations. Artaud's theatre also bridges the gap between performance studies and cinema, as he developed both according to similar affective ends. Artaud's theatre of cruelty was a short-lived affair, and therefore a lot of his ideas have resonated with later playwrights and directors through his various articles on the subject. His dramatic manifesto, offered in two parts in his The Theatre and its Double, prefigures a type of theatre that would champion the physical and not just the psychological, and it therefore originates from an organic apprehension of the body, as I'll show. As he put it, one cannot separate body and mind, for the sense, nor the sense from the intellect, particularly in a field where the unendingly repeated jading of our organs calls for sudden shocks to revive our understanding. If such a theatre was not always bloody, or at least not systematically so, it did intend to return to all the tried and tested magic means of affecting sensitivity. It wanted, in short, to make metaphysics enter the mind through the body. Corporeal transgression would speak directly to the nerves and the physiological through the exploitation of differing intensities of colour, light and sound, and the use of discordant vibrations and tremors, musical, rhythmic repetition, or that of spoken phrases. Without relying purely on blood and gore, the theatre of cruelty aspired to create a form of, quote, consciousness which illuminates life in a display of its essential carnage. And that's perhaps one of the most telling of these quotes. Such ideas are manifest in the incomplete writings for The Conquest of Mexico, which was planned to be the first production of Artaud's company. This scenario shows that the focus of the theatre of cruelty was not violence per se, although it was certainly important, but the overwhelming confusion of the senses. A huge number of actors would people the stage, all performing different actions simultaneously, and ensuring that the play, and not the actors, would stage events. Sensations of heat, cold, or claustrophobia would be produced through special lighting, colours, or an austere mise-en-scène. The positioning of the audience would also be crucial in obtaining the desired effect. Theatre-goers would not be sitting down, but rather inhabiting the theatrical space as bodies to be played and engaged with. This would guarantee a direct contact between audience and show. These are not actually stills from the theatre of cruelty, but from the Alfred Jarry theatre that Artaud worked with before he went on to develop ideas for the theatre of cruelty. So Artaud's project to reanimate theatre starts, as we can see, through a rethinking of its relation to the spectator, but also as a refusal of the stasis and conformism of contemporary Western drama. According to him, the idolatry and economic basis of culture is to blame for the loss of theatre as an organic, social form of power that could have a real transformative impact. Taking his cues from Oriental drama, particularly Balinese theatre, and its emphasis on hallucination and terror, Artaud launched a complete transvaluation of the form that would reintroduce the body and act as a form of plague on the spectator. This corporeal transmission would shake the audience out of the coma brought about by years of reactionary theatre, and it would do so through a reactivation of the relationship between the senses and the mind. Such a radical position relied heavily on a new conceptualization of space and on the implementation of radical performing techniques. In order to have a direct impact on the audience, actors had to be able to project feelings in a manner different to melodrama and its two-dimensional approach. The interaction between actor and spectator aimed at being symbiotic, something which made a new corporeal language necessary. Since, for Artaud, quote, every emotion has an organic basis, end quote, actors with their own bodies and perceiving the audience as doubles had to develop expert control of it in order to know where to affect them. This almost mystic or alchemical understanding of theatre was compared by Artaud to Chinese medicine, for it searches for the, quote, sensitive points governing even the subtlest faculties over the whole extent of human anatomy, in order to create a space where the mind can be reached through the organs. What is interesting about such a show aimed at the whole anatomy is that it is premised on a very Deleuze-Guattarian holistic model where the mind and the body are inextricable, and where the moment of affect liberates the body without organs. The Deleuzian socius is left behind, at least during the performance, and the stage is capable of, quote, disturbing our peace of mind, releasing our repressed subconscious, driving us to a kind of potential rebellion. And this through the championing of a physical language aimed at the senses and independent of speech, and these are Artaud's words. As has been suggested, the fact that the acting the acting practices are, quote, minimally articulated in Artaud's short critical pieces means that we rely on his literature for a semblance of the dramatic specificities of the theatre of cruelty. Now, having considered Artaud's theoretical propositions, I want to briefly assess their actual application to the stage. I think I did have a couple of quotes there. Yes, this would have been useful at the right time. So, having considered Artaud's theoretical propositions, I want to briefly assess their actual application to the stage by analysing corporeal affect in his most famous play, the Cenci. Since Artaud clearly favoured physical reaction over verbose or wordy passages, stage directions are of particular value to my study, and we'll be concentrating on those. I therefore pay attention here to the profusion and possible intentions of exploitative noises, that is, auditory violence, and also mutilation or corporeal violence. So, Artaud's last production to see the light of day, a forerunner to the theatre of cruelty's intended original programme, was the Cenci, which ran for 17 nights, but failed to create much of a stir. Whilst it was not necessarily received with hostility, the play was considered a failure, and no others were performed after it. The disappointing demise of Artaud's project has been the subject of academic discussion. The most popular view is that Artaud may have been unable to communicate his particular vision of theatre to his actors. I would like to add that perhaps another reason why the Cenci may have fallen short of its expectations is that the play does not encapsulate Artaud's theories of theatre as well as some of his unperformed pieces. As Percy B. Shelley had already explained in the preface to his own The Cenci, the quality of the Italian family's history, with its depraved and sordid father, possible rape and various murders and executions, made it a perfect subject for tragedy. Quote, clothing it to the apprehensions of his countrymen in such language and actions as would bring it home to their hearts, end quote, Shelley hoped that by playing down the horrors and emphasising the pleasure derived from the poetic nature of the sufferings, that the play could be aligned to great tragedies like Sophocles' Oedipus the King or Shakespeare's King Lear. Now, I am not proposing that Shelley succeeded in what Artaud did not, or that the latter could not see the tragic possibilities the Cenci scenario had to offer, but rather that the capacity to create empathy in the viewer, which is a basic requisite for the tragic form, seems to be an obvious quality of the original story. Shelley amplified it by toning down the violence and giving the characters, particularly Beatrice, long speeches through which to explore the origin and depth of their feelings. Artaud's treatment of the story is markedly different from Shelley's, but not altogether effective. Artaud's theory on language, mainly his neglect of spoken word and prioritization of noises or cries, was revolutionary and would have a tremendous impact on later pieces of the theatre of the absurd, like Eugene Ionesco's The Bold Soprano or The Chairs, where characters are seen articulating unintelligible sounds that eventually become phrases or sentences. Scenarios like Pour les oiseaux ou La place de l'amour, my French, you have to excuse my French, or La pierre philosophale, the philosopher's stone, are perfect examples of Artaud's linguistic ideas put into practice, with extensive stage directions that blur the boundaries between prose and drama, and only one or two lines uttered in each piece. The Cenci, on the other hand, does not take such liberties. If Cenci, the character, does make a point of explaining that, quote, the difference between crimes committed in life and those on stage is that in life we do more and say less, while on stage we talk and do very little, the actual speeches in the play are rather normative, and the use of sudden noises, colours, objects, or tonality is not particularly remarkable in the first 3 acts. Apart from an early orgy, which is glimpsed through a lifted veil and is accompanied by, quote, an amplified sound reflected in sharp ridges, end quote, in an interesting passage that describes the crowd of actors as, quote, a unique body drawing in its breath as if it had received a violent punch in the stomach. There is also little to indicate a special emphasis on corporeality. The setting in Act 2 attempts to generate impact through location, situating the scene in, quote, an indeterminate place, a moor, or perhaps a hall, a stairway, or gallery, what you will, darkness everywhere. Harking back to the Gothic stage as developed by Matthew Lewis and Joanna Bailey in its capacity to create affect through the mise-en-scène, Artaud's The Cenci also makes reference to the occasional obligatory storm or thunderclap. But Artaud does not, however, appear to offer a different play from Shelley's, at least up to this point. It is only the last scene that shows the extent to which the authors differ in their use of affect. Shelley's play does not give setting a major role, limiting the mise en scène to a whole of the prison, and the stage directions do not mention particular sounds or the tone of voices. Artaud's version, on the contrary, turns the cell into a full-blown torture chamber that reminded one reviewer of Piranesi's sketches. It includes, quote, a wheel suspended horizontally from above on a shaft running through the hub, from which Beatrice is seen, quote, hanging by her hair and being pushed along by a guard. It is worth noting that this scene was acted differently because the action was deemed too dangerous by actress Iya Abdi, who was instead strapped to the wheel horizontally. Such directorial decisions may have had an impact on audience affect, as the original envisioning of this scene is a lot more violent than its actual execution. The intended physicality is emphasised through the use of noises that make the prison comparable to, and I think I've got the quote here, yes, a factory at full production, and include stage directions such as the wheel turns or the prison screams, the latter indicating that the setting is important enough to be anthropomorphized. In Shelley, this scene culminates with the announcement of the fate of Beatrice and his brother, and that is, they must die, but the actual sentence imposed on them is never revealed. No punishment is made explicit, and only passing references to the engines or the rack remind us that the characters have been tortured. Artaud's version of the same scene exploits its potential for affect through the introduction of a procession to the block which, and this is a great stage direction I think, sets off on a 7-beat Inca rhythm that becomes louder and eventually merges with a kind of desperate human voice. These are also words from the play. But for all its more explicit affective appeal, the Cenci did not manage to have the desired spectatorial impact that Artaud perhaps desired, as I've mentioned. In comparison to the Cenci, Artaud's short scenarios exhibit a much more focused display of the qualities that could have brought his project to fruition. Amongst those that were never staged during Artaud's life, one stands out particularly for the conjunction of bodies and affect it offers. The Spurt of Blood, included originally in a collection entitled Umbilical Limbo, L'Ombilique de Lime, and published in 1925, works as the perfect counterpart to the Cenci. Even though it was not officially scheduled as part of the intended programme for the Theatre of Cruelty, it gives an indication of the full extent of Artaud's dramatic project. The Spurt of Blood received some attention after the playwright's death, and was performed by Peter Brook in 1964 as part of the Theatre of Cruelty season. As much as it can be said to have a plot, the play deals with the cataclysm that separates two lovers, the death of one of them, and the increasingly absurd corporeal exploitation of a wet nurse. It opens with the main characters introduced as a young man and a girl, professing their love and telling each other that everything is fine in a variety of tones. These include in a quickened, throbbing voice first, and then lower, and finally on an exalted, high-pitched tone. This idyllic, if already tense, beginning is soon interrupted in the style of Artaud's methodology of shock by several instances of almost unstageable violence. The well-made world of their mutual love is visited soon after a pause for silence by a sudden noise like a huge wheel spinning, blowing out wind, and most fantastically by a hurricane that comes between them. The stage directions indicate that at this moment two stars collide, and most tellingly a succession of limbs of flesh fall onto the stage. This limbic shower includes feet, hands, scarves, masks, and on a non-kind of organic or bodily take, if you like, colonnades, porticos, temples, and alembics, why not? And is followed by the descent onto the stage of a series of animals symbolising the plagues that visit mankind in the Bible. This visual onslaught is followed by the appearance of a group of actors speaking in different tones whilst thunder rages in the background. Such investment in the capacity of sound to affect an audience is only matched by the fixation on the ravaged female body of the wet nurse and the play's melodramatic acting, which often veers from one extreme of the emotional gamut to the other. Corporeality is emphasized by the grotesque eroticism evident in the wet nurse's histrionically inflated bosom, which she must hold with her hands wherever she goes. Her reduction to her body is manifest in the knight's request that she come closer, which is actually spelled out as "bring your breasts over here," and more tellingly in the play's final stage direction. Quote, "A host of scorpions crawl out from under the wet nurse's dress and start swarming in her vagina, which swells and splits, becomes transparent, and shimmers like the sun." Aside from the sheer complexity of staging this moment convincingly, the shocking value of such a scene is increased by the concession to genital nudity. The scorpions do not merely crawl down the nurse's legs, but emerge from her vagina. Shocking as this denouement must necessarily seem, for there is no previous action that could possibly prepare the viewer for the graphic turn of events, it seems a logical one to the play. Just before the climactic bodying forth of the nurse, a character simply referred to as the whore causes the spurt of blood of the play's title. God's refusal to let go of her drives her to bite on the huge hand that had seized her and had set her hair on fire. Hope you're following me here. This event leads to an extreme affective moment comparable to the performances of body artist Ron Athey in the 1990s. If Athey's projection of bodily fluids to the audience had the added impact that the artist was HIV positive, the great spurt of blood that slashes across the stage in Artaud's play would constitute a similar confrontational attack. This idea would seem to be seconded by the fact that the bleeding is seen partially through bursts of lightning, after which most of the actors resurface as corpses. Here I would like to pause for a minute and show you a couple of examples of the different treatments that this scenario has recently received, as I think that they're very revealing of the ways in which Artaud is being read and used, and as you'll see, they're very, very different from each other. So I'll play you those clips. Might not play the entire thing, because one of them is about 3 minutes long. So I'll just enough to give you a taste of what these companies have done with them. Right, so this is one of them. I mean, it's obviously very toned down. It's kind of for a non-professional, if you like, project or educational project, but it's kind of very minimalistic, very aestheticized version of the action in the play. Scenario, sorry. Anyway, you get the idea, and I'm going to show you the other one. This is for Cardinal Griffin drama. The other one I wanted to show you, as you'll see, is a very, very different kind of take on the Spurt of Blood. It's by Ignite.
Of blood. I love you, and everything is beautiful.
You love me, and everything is beautiful.
As you can probably see with that, it's a scenario that has been very susceptible to various treatments. Artaud's dramatic project was one that expected violent reactions from the audience. That's something that Ignite have very much taken up in that interpretation. Through a direct attack on theatre, particularly the position and role of the spectator, the theatre of Cruelty also aimed to critique the staples of social order and its hierarchical structures from family to justice. And this is an area that I don't really have time to explore in this paper. Space and time become a form of affective reality that draws attention to itself and to the dynamics of the dramatic performance. That is, its meaning beyond words. It is hopefully clear by now that Artaud's theatre, although perhaps not directly transferable to cinema, stylistically, belies a marked preoccupation with affect. This is an area that Artaud himself explored in a fragmented body of work composed of short theoretical pieces and brief scenarios. There is no difference between the cinema and the theatre, he wrote in an article about the affective possibilities of the former. In fact, according to him, people seek cinema precisely because it affords a more instant, quote, violent gratification than conventional drama. Although he felt quite strongly that drama had to find a way of competing with this new medium, Artaud would eventually succumb to the power of the moving image in his search for visual impact. Film reconfigures affect, for example, through the use of pre- and post-production techniques which are not generally available to theatre. Images can be selected for maximum impact, and they can be altered to create atmospheres conducive to concrete and syncretic feelings that can excite the spectatorial sensorium. It is therefore crucial that we envisage cinematic affect as intrinsically connected to Artaud's theatre of Cruelty. And this is where I move on to the second and shorter part of this talk. So Artaud distinguishes between two types of cinema in 1927, both of which he finds unsatisfactory. The first one, pure or absolute cinema, relies on abstraction, and although the connections between mind and figure are highly seductive, Artaud is not ultimately persuaded by the viability of a transfer between these and given human states of consciousness. The second type of cinema, which he calls a venial hybrid art, is psychological in nature and narrative-driven, and therefore better served, in his opinion, by the written text or the dramatic piece. Artaud then proposes a third filmic form that would see a return to the matter and meaning of film and would integrate action and sensation. This cinema, a melding experience, relies on the idea of, quote, shock on the eyes, drawn, one might say, from the very substance of the eye, and not from psychological circumlutions of a discursive nature which are nothing but visual interpretations of a text, end quote. The idea here is to extract the language of narrative, not to translate actions or interpret them cinematically, thus ensuring that the actions speak directly to the brain in an almost intuitive or even instinctual manner. A corollary of this affective philosophy of cinema, directly inherited, as I hope to have shown, from Artaud's own investment in theatre as a transformative art, is that through interaction with the image, viewers may revisit the barbarity of life, calls it that. And the idea of a return is important here. The type of cinema advocated by Artaud is, like the theatre of Cruelty, premised on the basis that it is somehow possible to bring mind and body in contact. He suggests that, quote, the human scheme of things, the germ of reality, this is the cinema's first toy. It exalts matter and makes it appear to us in its profound spirituality, in its relationship with the mind from which it emerges. The images are born, are deduced one from the other as images, impose an objective synthesis more penetrating than any abstraction, create worlds which ask nothing from anyone or anything. And this line is important. But from this mere game of appearances, from this sort of transubstantiation of elements, is born an inorganic language which moves the mind by osmosis and with no sort of transposition in words. And by the fact that it plays with matter itself, the cinema creates situations which emerge from a simple collision of objects, forms, repulsions and attractions. It does not separate itself from life, but returns to the primitive order of things. This is from 1927. Not the emphasis here on conveying affect directly onto the body and the mind, as well as the ontological changes this process should be able to effect. It is important to know that Artaud is largely writing about silent films, which expressly do not make use of written or spoken text, in his case. For Artaud, words were the murderer of film, imposing a textual indexing that was at odds with what he sees as the liberating power of the image. This diagram, taken from Gabriele Stoppelman's book on Artaud, illustrates his understanding of the role of cinema in our lives quite neatly, I think. As is expected, cinema cannot have a merely representational role, but must offer an interplay between given images and parts in us that might remain otherwise invisible. It might be interesting to think of this as a repressed unconscious, but I would argue that Artaud is more preoccupied with uncovering elements or structures that appear unreachable precisely because they are there in the first instance. So the visible invisible as opposed to something that is actively repressed, if you see what I mean. Such a cinema would be preoccupied with its direct impact on our perception of ourselves and the world around us. But groundbreaking as these ideas undoubtedly are, or precisely because of this, Artaud's actual cinematic ventures were as short-lived as his theatre of cruelty. In fact, it would be fair to say that in terms of his role in the history of film, Artaud is best remembered for his acting as Marat in Napoleon or in Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. Of his various film scenarios, only La Coquille and the Clergyman, the Seashell and the Clergyman, was developed for screen. Directed and shot by Germain Dulac in 1926 and premiering in Paris in 1928, La Coquille has often been identified as the first surrealist film and brings into action a few of Artaud's concerns. In his original scenario, a clergyman has a number of hallucinations that circle around the wife of a general, and this provides for a number of unconnected scenes that develop images as disparate as a tongue growing from a mouth to eternity. Dulac attempted to adapt some of these ideas to the screen through superimpositions, which you can see there, hopefully you can see there, or as in the case of the roads that extend compulsively, stop-track motion, even though there was no indication in the scenario of how this task should have been carried out. Most importantly, the film offers a couple of what we could call shock cuts, if you like. The first of these sees the clergyman attempting to throttle the general as he turns into a priest. You'll see it's quite unique. So I'm going to play you that scene. It's about 2 minutes long. The music has been added later. It wouldn't have been there in its original showing. As you can see, the confessionist's face grows light in an attempt to show fragmentation and collapse, and the tension is conveyed through intense facial expression and aggressive body language. The other scene comes towards the end and is perhaps the most corporeally invested, which is the one I'm going to show you now. The tearing of the corset is sudden and unexpected, and is followed by a predatorial run that I've got no time to show you, which emphasises the violence of this moment. On the one hand, this is a moment that's obviously heavy, pregnant with symbolism, but should also be understood as part and parcel of surrealism's broader agenda. That is, how it might act as a vehicle for ocular assault. That's from the clip I just showed you. This ethos is spelled out in the literal attacks on the eye in 3 contemporary films. Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin from 1925, L'Âge d'Or, there on bottom right, and iconically in Buñuel and Dali's Un Chien Andalou from 1929, which completely eclipsed La Coquille. The latter features an opening sequence that sees a woman having her eye sliced open. Dulac's decorseting, I would argue, can be seen to start this tradition, particularly since, like surrealism, the film is also interested in exploring the interplay between sight, screen, identity and consciousness through dreamlike imagery. These connections form a bridge between Artaud's dramatic and cinematic projects and may be seen as a proto-affective predecessor for the development of the horror film. Because to call well-established instances in film history, like La Coquille, horror, might appear contentious, or even an anachronistic travesty, it is important to formulate the framework for such a claim. Artaud's connections to scenes of horror is apparent from a brief look at his other writings. He famously adapted Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which together with Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho is one of the most emblematic and studied examples of the 18th century Gothic novel. His 32, and this is the title, film scenario features a Frankenstein-like laboratory and a vampire, a traditional figure of horror literature and film. Most interestingly, the Butcher's Revolt resonates at the level of corporeal mutilation with the Philosopher's Stone, which also saw an array of limbs on stage. The Butcher's Revolt features a madman who is fascinated by the similarities between the texture of animal meat and that of human flesh, an obsession initially sparked by a carcass falling off a truck. You know, I think it's not difficult to see how these connections play out in the horror film as well throughout the 20th century. In a note in the Revue Française in 1930, Artaud described the scenario as negotiating, and I think if you hear the key terms here, they could just as well be applied to horror. Eroticism, cruelty, the taste for blood, the search for violence, obsession with the horrible, dissolution of moral values, social hypocrisy, lies, false witness, sadism, perversity. His own interpretation of the imagery in this piece resonates with contemporary films that are now considered an essential part of horror history. For instance, Nosferatu banked on Count Orlok, based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it has certain affinities with his scenario 32. Nosferatu is also a film that may not have been perceived as horror upon its first showing, entrenched as it is as at a stylistic level in German Expressionism, but which has become an essential part of the canon. Similarly, the hallucinatory nightmares of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I'm going to give you a second to take in the slides before I move on to the next one. So that's the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But also Carl Dreyer's Vampire, based on Sheridan Le Fanu's influential lesbian vampire story Carmilla, use an oniric language that resonates with La Coquille. These films too are now seen as foundational pre-universal examples of horror film, and I mean Universal Studios here, and use the landscapes of the unconscious to bring repressed anxieties to the open. Needless to say, this has been historically perceived by critics like Robin Wood as one of the staples of the genre. Finally, the nudity of the corset scene in Dulac's film is reminiscent of the affective landscapes of Hexen or Witchcraft Through the Ages, another film that sought to create an uncomfortable rapport between viewer and screen via shocking scenarios that included enactments of punishment and nudity. I don't know if you can see it very well from there, but it's a woman having her fingers screwed together. The idea of cinema as a problematic and affective medium, one that would launch a literal attack on the retina of the spectator, is, as I have noted, also recognisable in the work of the surrealists, who very actively appealed to the viewer's somatic body. Like the razor blade gesture of Un Chien Andalou, Artaud's filmic ideas sought to confront representation by, quote, tearing the image away and transplanting it directly into the film spectator's ocular nerves and sensations. This type of cinema would consist of purely visual sensations in which the force would emerge from a collision exacted on the eyes. Artaud's influential ideas for a cinema of cruelty that arouses horror in viewers makes an ocular claim more largely applicable to the medium itself. In fact, since the 1970s, cinema has been understood as affective in its inception, as Tom Ganning's theories on the cinema of attractions have shown. Optic effects like kinetoscopes and special effects in drama, especially those used in Gothic plays, had a major impact in the development of early cinema, particularly in the work of Georges Méliès and Segundo de Chamon, both of whom experimented with the supernatural and the fantastic. Artaud's cinema sits uncomfortably within this heritage as a project that attempts to create viewing responses that rely on the connection between visual impact and the viewing subject. Like Artaud's dramatic work, it seeks to affect the body through the body and to explore its limits. As Stephen Barber has succinctly put it, quote, to transform or transmit the body is the intention of all Artaud's work. Visual sensation becomes the only common denominator amongst images and performances that do not rest on a received language, but rather work together to create a sensory overload. The more conventional narrative frameworks of the horror productions that would bloom after the first self-professed horror film, and that was Wales's Frankenstein in 1932, seemingly removed from the more apparently intellectual wanderings of Artaud. I, however, choose to see his work as the kernel of a growing interest in the effective qualities of moving images. Whilst Artaud ultimately sought to resist representation and judgment, both his dramatic and cinematic scenarios in what would become the horror film start off with the same premise. What if bodies could be physically and psychically affected by ocular attack? Like the theatre of cruelty, what is at stake here is the possibility of forcing the bodies of spectators to react to their own materiality. I would like to leave you with this quote from Artaud. There is also a sort of physical excitement which the rotation of the images communicates directly to the brain. The mind moves beyond the power of representation. This sort of virtual power of the images probes for hitherto unused possibilities in the depths of the mind. Essentially, the cinema reveals a whole occult life with which it puts us directly into contact. I, for one, cannot think of a better way to describe the effective qualities of art. Thank you.